4 years was long enough to change a person completely. Conrad had told himself this on the long ride south. He had repeated it through 2 countries, through false leads and dead ends and the specific, grinding patience of a search that had no guaranteed conclusion. He had used it as both warning and preparation, a way of managing whatever he might find when Soren's intelligence finally led him to the right city, the right street, the right ordinary corner of the human world where his Luna had chosen to disappear into. 4 years changes a person. He had not been prepared for how completely it had changed her, or how clearly the change was an improvement. He saw her before she saw him. That was the thing he had not anticipated, that he would have a moment of watching her before the recognition landed. A few seconds of simply seeing her as she was now, without the weight of history between them distorting the image. She came through the bakery door onto the cobblestone street with a basket over one arm and a laugh already halfway out of her, responding to something the wide woman in the baker's apron had said behind her. It was a real laugh, unguarded, unhurried, the laugh of a woman who had not been performing ease for so long that she had forgotten what ease actually felt like. She wore a simple, practical, deep blue dress. No velvet, no lunar mark displayed, no careful arrangement of a woman managing how she was perceived by people with power over her. Just herself, moving through a street that knew her name, nodding to the fishmonger 2 doors down, stepping around a cart with the automatic familiarity of someone who had walked this path enough times that her feet knew it without instruction. Conrad stood on the opposite side of the street and felt something in his chest. Do something he could not name precisely. Not quite grief, not quite relief. Somewhere in the narrow, painful territory between the two. Then the boy appeared. He came through the bakery door 10 seconds after his mother, moving with the focused, purposeful energy of a small person who had somewhere important to be. Dark hair, her build, her particular quality of moving through the world with quiet self-possession. He was carrying a smooth river stone in each hand, and when he looked up, scanning the street the way children do, cataloging the world with that unself-conscious directness that adults spend years learning to suppress, his eyes caught the morning light. Silver, clear and sharp and entirely unmistakable. Conrad's own eyes, set in a small face he had never seen before, looking out at a world his father had played no part in building for him. Conrad stopped breathing for a moment. He had known. He had done the arithmetic 4 years ago, in his empty study, with the ring in his fist, and the map on the wall, and the understanding that somewhere beyond the borders of his kingdom, a child of his existed. He had carried that knowledge like a stone pressed against his sternum every day since. Knowing and seeing were entirely different countries. The boy crouched on the front step and began arranging his stones with the serious concentration of someone conducting important work. He did not look up again. He did not know that the tall stranger across the street was fighting to keep his composure in the middle of an ordinary human morning. He did not know anything yet. Conrad watched him for a long time, long enough to see the way he looked up when his mother said something, the immediate attentiveness, the small smile, the way he reached for her hand with the absolute security of a child who had never once had reason to doubt whether it would be there. She had done that, alone, without him, without the kingdom, or its resources, or any of the things Conrad had told himself. A child needed. She had given their son that security entirely by herself. The boy laughed at something, a bright, clean, uncomplicated sound that traveled across the cobblestone street and landed somewhere in Conrad's chest with the precision of something aimed. He was happy. Without him, the realization did not arrive with the sharp violence of a blade. It came the way the most important truths always came, slowly, quietly, and with the specific weight of something that could not be unfelt once it had settled. Conrad was not a man who had often been genuinely humbled. He understood, standing on that street in the ordinary morning light of a human city, that he could not walk across to them like a king arriving to reclaim what was his. Whatever happened next would not be governed by title or authority or the ancient laws of the Silverfang kingdom. He had broken her heart with power, once already. What was required now was something he had considerably less practice with. He would have to approach her simply as the man who had failed her, and hope, with no reasonable right to it, that it was not already too late. She noticed him on the second day. Janelle had spent too many years developing the particular alertness of a woman who had learned that safety was something you maintained rather than something you were simply given. She noticed patterns. She noticed when something in her environment had changed. She noticed the tall figure in the plain dark cloak who had been standing at the edge of the street near the grain merchant's stall for 2 mornings in a row, always angled toward the bakery, always still in the specific way that people were still when they were trying not to be noticed. She recognized the stillness before she recognized the man. On the 3rd morning, she came through the bakery door alone, basket deliberately left inside, and walked directly across the street. She stopped 4 feet away from him. "How long?" she said quietly. Conrad turned. He had the grace, at least, not to pretend. 3 days. She studied his face with the focused attention she gave difficult diagnoses, looking for what was actually there, rather than what she expected to find. He was older, not dramatically, but in the way that years of genuine weight aged a person. Something in the set of his jaw, the quality of stillness around his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept easily in a long time. She did not let that soften her. "You should have announced yourself," she said. "I know." A pause. "I wasn't certain you wouldn't disappear again." Before I could explain. The honesty of it, plain and undefended, was unexpected enough that she said nothing for a moment. Around them, the street continued its indifferent morning business. Cartwheels on cobblestone, the smell of bread from the open bakery door behind her. The entirely ordinary world she had built going about itself, as though nothing significant was happening at its edges. "Then explain," she said. "Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button, and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now, let's dive in." He told her everything. He did not manage it artfully, or arrange it for maximum sympathy. He simply told her, standing on a public street in a human city, 4 years after the worst night of her life, what had actually been happening behind the council chamber door, while she stood in the corridor and heard her, marriage dismantled in casual conversation. Elder Kane's private meeting, the council's plan, the specific and terminal nature of what they had intended for an Omega Luna, they had decided was an unacceptable liability, not exile, not formal dismissal, the other kind of removal. Janelle listened without interrupting. He told her about Seraphine, the conversation they had, the arrangement they constructed together, the calculated fiction of an affair designed to convince dangerous men that patience served them better than action, that Conrad was already moving toward what they wanted, that there was no need for anything irreversible. It had worked. The council had waited. And while they waited, Conrad had been quietly building a case to dismantle their authority entirely. "You overheard the conversation before I could tell you the truth," he said. "I came back to the quarters that night to explain everything. You were already gone." The street was quiet between them. Janelle looked at the middle distance for a long moment, that internal stillness she moved into when she was doing the painful work of reassembling her understanding of something she thought she already knew. 4 years of grief. 4 years of raising their son alone on the architecture of a betrayal that had never actually happened. The anger she expected did not arrive in the form she anticipated. It came quietly, the way her worst grief always came, not as fire, but as something colder and more permanent. "I understand why you did it," she said finally. He exhaled, but that does not erase what it felt like to hear it. Her eyes met his directly. "I stood in that corridor and listened to the man who swore before the moon goddess that I would always be safe beside him, laugh about another woman while I was 5 months pregnant. And you were not there to explain. You were never there." Conrad said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve on silence. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned toward the bakery. "Come inside," she said quietly. "He deserves to meet you." She did not look back to see if he followed. She already knew that he would. Elias was at the kitchen table when they came inside. He had graduated from the front step to the indoors at some point during the morning and had brought his river stones with him, 6 of them now arranged in a careful line across the worn wood surface, ordered by some system of logic that was entirely his own. He did not look up immediately when the door opened. He was in the middle of something. Janelle set her basket on the counter. "Elias," He looked up then, and his silver eyes moved immediately past his mother to the tall figure standing just inside the doorway. Children had a specific quality of assessment that adults spent years learning to perform and never quite recovered. Elias looked at Conrad the way he looked at everything unfamiliar directly, without performance, cataloging. Conrad stood very still under the weight of it. "Come here," Janelle said gently. Elias climbed down from the chair and crossed the kitchen with the unhurried confidence of a child who had never been given reason to approach the world with his shoulders up. He stopped in front of his mother and looked up at the stranger again. Up close, the resemblance was even more complete. The dark hair, the particular set of the jaw, and those eyes, Conrad's own eyes, clear and silver and utterly without guile, looking up at him from a face that was entirely new and somehow entirely familiar at the same time. Janelle rested her hand lightly on her son's shoulder. "This is your father," she said simply. No embellishment, no apology wrapped around it. Just the plain fact of it, delivered with the steady voice of a woman who had decided her son deserved the truth without complicated edges. Elias studied Conrad for a long moment. Then he asked the question, quietly, without accusation, with the specific, devastating directness of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned that some questions were supposed to be softened before they were spoken. "Why didn't you come sooner?" The kitchen was very still. Conrad crouched down to the boy's eye level slowly, the way you moved around something you did not want to frighten until they were face to face. Silver eyes to silver eyes. "Because I didn't know where you were," he said. "I looked for you, for a long time." A pause. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you." Elias considered this with the focused seriousness of a child weighing a response against some internal standard of reasonableness. Then he held out one of his river stones, the smoothest one, the one that sat at the center of his arrangement. Conrad looked at it for a moment. Then he held out his hand and let the boy place it in his palm. "That's the best one," Elias said, by way of explanation. Conrad closed his fingers around it carefully. "I'll keep it safe," he said. The morning unfolded in the unhurried way that mornings did when children were in charge of the pace. Elias decided without asking anyone's permission that Conrad needed to see the bakery properly. Not the kitchen where they were standing, but the real bakery downstairs. The ovens, the long wooden bread paddles, the shelf where Dora kept the honey cakes that were theoretically for customers but practically, Elias explained with transparent confidence, available to people who helped stack the flour sacks. Conrad followed him down the narrow stairs without comment. He spent 20 minutes receiving a thorough introduction to a bakery from a 4-year-old who knew the name of every tool and was not shy about sharing this information. Conrad listened to all of it with the complete attention of a man who understood, at some fundamental level, that this was the most important meeting he had ever attended. Between the flour sacks and the bread paddles, Elias asked about wolves. Did they really change shape? Were they bigger than dogs? Could his father change shape? Conrad answered each question honestly and without embellishment, and watched his son's silver eyes go wide at each answer, with the specific satisfaction of a child receiving confirmation that the world was even more interesting than previously suspected. Then Elias asked about the moon. Why did wolves care about it? Conrad sat down on a low wooden stool in the warm bakery, the Alpha King of the Silver Fang Kingdom, sitting on a flour-dusted stool in a human city bakery, and told his son about the moon the way it had been told to him long ago, before the weight of governing it had made it feel like obligation rather than wonder. The moon, he said, was how wolves found what they were looking for, even when they had been searching a very long time, even when they had almost stopped believing they would find it. Elias listened with his chin in both hands and his riverstone beside him on the stool, and when Conrad finished, the boy looked up at him with those silver eyes and said simply, "I like that." Upstairs, Janelle stood at the kitchen window, listening to the low sound of her son's laughter drifting up through the floorboards. She pressed her fingers against the window frame and breathed. Conrad had not looked at Elias the way powerful men looked at heirs. He had looked at him the way a man looked at something he had been afraid he would never find. The grief she had carried for 4 years did not disappear in that moment. It did not dissolve or resolve or rearrange itself into something painless, but something that had been rigid inside her for a very long time shifted slightly, just enough to let something else in. Not forgiveness yet, not trust, but the small, cautious, terrifying thing that lived just before both of them. Hope. Elias fell asleep after lunch. This was apparently non-negotiable, a daily event that Janelle managed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped fighting the biology of small children. She settled him in the narrow room off the kitchen, left the door slightly open, and came back to find Conrad standing at the window with his hands behind his back looking out at the cobblestone street below. It was the same posture she had seen 100 times in the castle. The posture of a man organizing his thoughts before he spoke them. She put the kettle on. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. He turned from the window. "The rest. The parts you left out this morning." She kept her back to him, setting out 2 plain ceramic cups with the calm of a woman who had learned that difficult conversations were easier when your hands had something to do. "You told me what the council planned. You told me about the lie. But there is a larger story behind Seraphine's name, and I want to hear it." She heard him pull out the chair across the table. The wood scraped quietly against the stone floor. He sat. The Ashvale Pack had been seeking independence from the Silverfang Kingdom's territorial authority for 3 generations. Conrad explained it plainly, without the political framing that council men used when they wanted to make complicated self-interest sound like reasonable governance. The Ashvale land sat along the eastern boundary, rich in timber, strategically positioned near 2 trade routes, populated by wolves who had their own traditions and their own leadership structures, and who had never particularly wanted to be governed by a distant alpha king whose primary interest in their territory was its tax contribution. Seraphine's father had negotiated for independence through official channels for 20 years and gotten nowhere. Seraphine had taken a different approach. "She came to me directly," Conrad said. "Not through the council. Privately. She was very clear about what she wanted: full territorial autonomy for the Ashvale Pack, recognized in writing, protected under kingdom law, no tribute, no conscription for kingdom wars, the right to govern themselves." "And what did she want to trade for it?" "Nothing she was actually willing to give." A pause. The council had decided the alliance would be formalized through a mating bond, her bloodline strengthening the throne. An heir with Ashvale and Silverfang lineage combined. Janelle set the cups on the table and sat down. "But Seraphine never wanted that." "Seraphine," Conrad said, with something that might have been the distant edge of respect, wanted what her father had spent 20 years trying to get. "She had no interest in a throne. She had no interest in me. What she needed was leverage, and the council had handed it to her by making her the centerpiece of their plan to remove you." Janelle wrapped both hands around her cup. "So she used it. We both used it," Conrad said. "She came to me when she understood what the council was planning for you. Not out of sentiment, she was honest about that. But she was not willing to be the instrument of a woman's death, even indirectly. We made an arrangement. The arrangement had been straightforward in the way that only genuinely calculated plans could be. Conrad would give the council the performance they wanted. The suggestion of an affair, the implication that he was already moving toward what they demanded. The council would wait. And while they waited, Conrad would build the legal framework to strip their authority and recognize Ashvale independence without their approval. "It should have worked," he said quietly. "I had 3 weeks, maybe 4. Enough time to tell you everything, to explain, to move you somewhere safe before the council realized what I was doing. But I heard the conversation on the 2nd week." "Yes." Janelle looked at the table for a long moment. She thought about the corridor. The cold stone pillar, the amber candlelight and the easy laughter, and the sound of his voice, her Conrad's voice, speaking about another woman with such careless warmth that she had not once considered it might be a performance. She thought about the 4 years that had followed. "What happened to Seraphine?" she asked. "After I left. The alliance collapsed. Without you there to protect, the council's leverage over me disappeared entirely." Conrad set his cup down. "I moved against them within a month. It was not clean, but it was thorough. And Seraphine, she secured independence for her pack through formal diplomacy 2 years ago." A brief pause. "She leads the Ashvale Pack now as Alpha in her own right." She negotiated well. Janelle was quiet for a long moment. She had spent 4 years constructing a version of Seraphine Ashvale. In her mind, a noble-born she-wolf with political connections and the particular confidence of a woman who had never once been made to feel peripheral. A woman built for the space beside a throne in all the ways Janelle had never been. A rival, an intended replacement. The woman for whom she had not been enough. She understood now, with the slow, restructuring clarity of someone having an old wound properly cleaned for the first time, that Seraphine had never been any of those things. She had been a woman trying to secure her people's freedom inside a political system that required her to be something she wasn't. The same system that had required Janelle to be something she wasn't. Different circumstances, different costs. The same council moving them both like pieces on a board, without asking whether either of them had agreed to play. "We were never enemies," Janelle said. It was not a question. "No," Conrad said. "You were never enemies." She looked up at him across the plain kitchen table, with its 2 ceramic cups, and the distant sound of her son breathing steadily in the next room. "The council made me afraid of a woman who was trying to protect her people," she said, "and they made you choose between a lie that saved my life and the truth that might have cost it." Conrad said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. Some truths didn't require a response. They only required the quiet, difficult work of being fully seen. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the kitchen floor. Elias slept on in the next room with the total commitment of small children, undisturbed by the weight of the conversation happening 10 feet away. Outside, the city continued its ordinary business cartwheels, distant voices, the smell of the river carried on a light wind through the window Janelle had cracked open after lunch. She had refilled both cups twice. Neither of them had moved from the table. "Tell me what happened after I left," she said. Conrad turned his cup slowly between his hands, a gesture she recognized from the castle library, from the late nights when he was working through something he had not yet fully resolved. She had catalogued these details without meaning to, years ago. The architecture of a person you had loved completely was not something you simply forgot. "The first week, I was focused entirely on finding you," he said. "I sent Soren south within 2 days. I had your likely route mapped by the end of the first night, but it took 4 years. You were thorough," he said. There was no accusation in it. Something closer to recognition. She said nothing and let him continue. The council had made their first mistake 6 weeks after Janelle disappeared. Elder Kane had come to Conrad with what he clearly believed was welcome news, that the Luna's absence had already begun to stabilize certain noble alliances, that several families who had withdrawn their pledges after the selection ceremony were now signaling willingness to re-engage, that the situation had resolved itself in a manner that served the kingdom's long-term interests. He had used the phrase, "resolved itself." Conrad told Janelle this with the flat economy of a man recounting something he still found difficult to speak about without the anger returning. "I had been patient with the council for years," he said. "I had managed them, negotiated around them, chosen the longer strategic path, because dismantling centuries of institutional authority required more than anger, it required architecture." He paused. "But when Kane stood in my study and used those words about you, about my Luna, about my child who was somewhere in the world without me, because of what they had engineered, the patience was finished. He had moved against them within the month. Not with the blunt force of a king removing inconvenient men that was temporary, replaceable, ultimately pointless. He had moved against the structures that gave them power, the appointment protocols, the veto authorities over royal decisions that had been embedded in kingdom law for 200 years and had never once been examined critically, because they had always served the people who wrote the histories. He had examined them, systematically, thoroughly, with the focused energy of a man who needed something to do with grief that had nowhere else to go. Elder Kane lost his seat within 6 weeks. Elder Morrow and Elder Price followed before the frost season ended. The council still existed, an institution that all did not disappear cleanly, and Conrad had not wanted the chaos of a complete power vacuum, but the version of it that could engineer the removal of a Luna, that could treat an Omega woman's life as a negotiating position, that could meet privately to discuss permanent solutions to political inconveniences. That version was gone. And the laws? Janelle asked quietly. Conrad was still for a moment. Omegas have formal rights in the Silverfang Kingdom now, he said. Legal standing, property rights, protection under pack law equal to any other designation. The right to refuse bonding without council approval. He paused. The right to serve in any role within the kingdom structure, including positions previously restricted to noble bloodlines. He said it plainly, without the tone of a man expecting credit. Janelle listened to all of it, with her hands wrapped around her cup and her eyes on the middle distance. That internal stillness of a woman, processing something that was going to take longer than a single afternoon to fully absorb. The world she had needed. The protections that would have changed everything, her place in the kingdom, her standing with the council, the entire impossible architecture of the situation that had made her so vulnerable to the lie that destroyed them. He had built it, after she was already gone. You built the world I needed, she said softly, after I was already gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Conrad set his cup down. He did not defend himself against the truth of it. He did not explain the timeline, or the political constraints, or the practical realities of dismantling institutional power structures that had existed for generations. He did not reach for any of the reasonable, accurate, genuinely mitigating context that existed. He simply said what was true. Yes. His voice was low and completely unguarded. And there is not a day that has passed in 4 years that I have not understood exactly what that means. He looked at her directly. I would undo it all, Janelle. Every law I changed, every elder I removed, every reform that carries my name now in the kingdom records. A pause. I would undo all of it without hesitation if it meant I had those 4 years back. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had failed her in the most complete way available to him, at the man who had then spent 4 years quietly building, in her absence, the kingdom she should have been able to live in. She did not tell him that it was enough. It wasn't enough, but she held his gaze and did not look away. And that, for now, was the most honest thing she had to offer. He asked her on the 3rd day. Not impulsively. Conrad had never done anything impulsively in his life, and 4 years of consequence had not changed that particular quality. She could see him building toward it the way she had always been able to read him, even when she hadn't wanted to admit she could. The careful way he chose his words, the slight tension around his eyes when Elias went to bed and the apartment went quiet, and there was nothing left between them but the low light of the oil lamp and the unfinished business of 2 people who had loved each other badly. She had known it was coming. She waited for him to find his way to it. Come back, he said finally. Simple, direct, the way he said everything that mattered. Not for the kingdom, not for the council or the throne, or the succession. He looked at her steadily across the table. For me, as my Luna. Because that is what you are, and what you have always been, and I have not stopped believing that for a single day in 4 years. He set the Luna ring on the table between them. She had not seen it since the night she left it on his map. It sat in the lamplight, looking exactly as she remembered, small and silver, and carrying the particular weight of a decision she had made alone in the dark, while 5 months pregnant and completely certain she had been discarded. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked away. She thought about the corridor, not as punishment. She had passed the stage of using old pain as a weapon sometime in the 2nd year, when she had realized that wielding grief against an absent person primarily wounded the one holding it. But she needed to think about it honestly, the way a healer examined a site of old injury before deciding whether it had truly healed or simply scarred over something that was still broken underneath. She thought about what it had felt like to stand in that cold stone corridor and hear the laughter, the specific devastation of it, not the sharp immediate violence of a betrayal, but the slow architectural collapse, the way every tender memory had rearranged itself in the light of those words into something that looked exactly like evidence of a woman being managed rather than loved. She thought about the 3 days after, packing in silence, the ring on the map, the healer's exit in the south wall, the cold pre-dawn air hitting her face, and the deliberate choice not to look back. She thought about Varen, the room above the bakery, Dora's practical kindness, the slow, careful construction of a practice built entirely on her own skill and her own reputation and her own judgment, with no throne beside her and no king's authority lending her credibility she hadn't earned herself. She thought about Elias being born in the first snowfall, the weight of him, the silver eyes looking up at her from a face that was entirely new and entirely hers. She thought about who she had been when she arrived in this city, hollowed out and heartbroken, and carrying the particular fragility of a woman who had built her sense of safety inside someone else and had it collapse entirely. And she thought about who she was now. She picked up the ring, held it in her palm the way she had held it the night she left, feeling its weight, examining what it asked of her. Then she set it back down gently. "No," she said. The word was quiet. There was no anger in it, no residual bitterness, no performance of strength over pain. It was simply the most honest syllable available to her, and she offered it to him with the same plainness he had always respected in her. Conrad said nothing. He had prepared himself for this. She could see that too. "I am not the woman who stood at the back of that grand hall anymore," she said. "I am not the Omega Luna who needed a king to tell her she was worth choosing." She looked at him steadily. "I built something here that belongs entirely to me. My practice, my home, my son's life, my own life." A pause. "I built it from nothing, Conrad. With my own hands, and it is mine in a way that nothing inside your castle ever truly was." She folded her hands on the table. "I am not willing to set it down." The lamp flickered between them. Conrad looked at the ring for a long moment. Then he picked it up and closed his fist around it, not with anger, with the quiet dignity of a man accepting the consequence of his own story. "I understand," he said. And the thing was, looking at his face in the low amber light, she believed that he did. The silence after his answer lasted long enough to become something other than uncomfortable. It settled between them like weather that had finally decided what it was going to do, not the charged, unresolved tension of the previous days, but something quieter, something that had found its shape. Janelle was the one who broke it. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it as what it is, not as an opening, not as a softening of what I just told you, simply as the truth." Conrad looked at her steadily. "All right. Elias asked me about his father before he could properly form the sentence," she said. "He was barely 3. He pointed at the other children on the street whose fathers came home in the evenings, and he looked at me with those eyes of yours and asked where his was." She paused. "I told him his father was a good man who didn't know where to find us yet. I told him that every single time he asked." Something moved across Conrad's face that he did not try to control. "I told him that," she continued, "because I did not want my son to carry the weight of a story I was still too angry to tell accurately. And because somewhere underneath the anger, I think I always knew that what I heard in that corridor was not the complete truth." She looked at the table. "I couldn't have named that for the first 2 years, but it was there." Conrad set the ring down quietly between them. Neither of them looked at it. "I don't want Elias to grow up without his father," Janelle said. "That was never what I wanted, not even when the grief was at its worst. I wanted him to grow up without confusion, without a father who was present in name and absent in reality, without the particular damage that does to a child." She met Conrad's eyes. "But he is 4 years old, and he gave you his best river stone this morning, and he laughed at everything you said in that bakery. And I am not willing to take that from him because of what happened between us." Conrad was very still. "What are you proposing?" he asked carefully. She had thought about it more than she let show, not in the days since his arrival, longer than that. In the quiet evenings when Elias was asleep, and the bakery was closed, and the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, and she sat alone with the version of the future she was slowly, deliberately constructing. She had known, in some practical corner of herself, that Conrad finding them was eventually more likely than not, that a man with his resources and his motivation and his particular quality of patient determination did not simply accept a permanent absence. She had thought about what she would do when it happened. "Elias spends time in the kingdom," she said. "Not permanently, not yet. Not while he is this young and his life is here. But visits, long enough for him to understand where he comes from, long enough to know his heritage, his bloodline, the world that is part of him whether either of us chose it or not." She paused. "And you come here, regularly, without an entourage and without the crown. You come as his father. You sit at this table, and you eat Dora's bread, and you learn what his life actually looks like. And us? Conrad asked quietly. There is no us in the way you mean it, she said, without cruelty. But there is this. She gestured between them, the table, the cups, the apartment above the bakery that smelled of warm bread and river water, and the life she had made from nothing. Two people who made a child together, who owe that child the dignity of a family that functions, not the family either of us imagined, but a real one, built on honesty instead of what we thought we were supposed to be to each other. Conrad was quiet for a long moment. She watched him absorb it, the permanent shape of what she was offering and the permanent shape of what she was not. The distinction between a door left open and a door with a different room behind it than the one he had been hoping for. He was not a man who accepted limitation easily, but he was, she had always known, a man capable of genuine humility when the situation removed every alternative. I accept, he said simply. I know you wanted more than this, she said. I wanted everything back, he said honestly. But what you're offering is more than I had yesterday, more than I had 4 years ago. He looked toward the door of the room where Elias slept. And infinitely more than I deserve. She stood and began clearing the cups from the table. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. Elias has been asking about wolves shifting since you told him it was possible. He will not let it rest, and I have no useful answers for him. Something changed in Conrad's expression. Small, carefully managed. But she had always been good at reading the things he tried not to show. I'll be here, he said. He stood, picked up his cloak from the chair back, and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Thank you, Janelle. She did not tell him he was welcome, but she did not look away either. And when the door closed behind him, and the apartment settled back into its familiar quiet, she stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the cobblestone street below and felt, for the first time since the night everything broke, that the story between them had finally found the shape it was always supposed to have. Not the one either of them had written for it, but a true one. And sometimes, she had learned, true was better than perfect. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Conrad's visit. Janelle was in the middle of a consultation when Dora appeared in the doorway of the small healing room, with an expression that managed to communicate several things simultaneously, that someone was waiting, that the someone was unusual, and that Dora had formed a significant opinion about this in the 30 seconds since opening the front door. Woman outside, Dora said. Well-dressed, says she knows you. A pause waited with editorial judgment. Doesn't look like she needs a healer. Janelle finished wrapping the elderly man's wrist, gave him instructions she made him repeat back to her, and walked him to the door before she went to see who was waiting. Seraphine Ashvale was standing on the front step of the bakery, the way people stood when they had decided to be somewhere and were not particularly anxious about what that required of them. She was tall, dark-eyed, dressed in practical traveling clothes of deep green and grey, with no visible insignia, though she carried herself with the specific quality of a woman who had stopped needing external markers to communicate her authority some time ago. She was, Janelle noted with the detached accuracy of a healer making an assessment, nothing like the version she had constructed in her mind over 4 years. The imagined Seraphine had been all edges and ambition, and the cool particular beauty of a woman who had been told since childhood that she was meant for something significant. The actual Seraphine looked at her from the front step with dark eyes that held something Janelle had not expected. Discomfort. The genuine, unperformed discomfort of a person who had rehearsed something difficult and was now standing at the moment of having to actually say it. I should have come sooner, Seraphine said. I wasn't certain you'd want to see me. Janelle studied her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Conrad had told her the outline of the story, where Elias had shared his river stones, where the shape of the future had slowly been negotiated over ceramic cups and afternoon light. Janelle made tea. Seraphine sat with her hands folded in front of her and waited, which told Janelle something about her, that she understood this was not her space, and that the pace of it belonged to the woman who lived here. Conrad told me the full arrangement, Janelle said, setting a cup in front of her. I understand what you did and why. Conrad told you his version, Seraphine said. Not defensively, simply accurately. I wanted you to hear mine. Janelle sat down across from her. Then tell it. Seraphine's version was not significantly different in its facts. But facts, Janelle had learned, were only part of what made a story true. The texture of it mattered. The reasons behind the reasons. Seraphine told her about the night Elder Kane had come to her father's pack under the pretense of a diplomatic visit and laid out, with the comfortable matter-of-factness of a man who had made this kind of calculation before, what the Council intended for the Omega Luna and how the Ashvale Pack's cooperation, or at minimum their silence, would be generously remembered when territorial negotiations resumed. Her father had been old, tired from decades of fighting the same institutional walls. He had not said yes, but he had not said no in the way that mattered. Seraphine had said no in the way that mattered. I went to Conrad because I was not willing to be the reason a pregnant woman died in a castle corridor, she said plainly. Not out of nobility. I want to be honest with you about that. I went because I could see exactly how the council intended to use my name and my family's silence, and I refused to be their instrument. She looked at Janelle directly. But I also need to tell you that I understood, when we built that lie together, that there was a risk, that it could be overheard, that the timing was fragile. Her jaw tightened slightly. I told Conrad it needed to happen faster, that you needed to be told the truth before the performance was ever given. A pause. He believed he had more time than he did. And you have carried that, Janelle said quietly, not as accusation, as recognition. I have carried that, Seraphine said. Yes. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved through its Tuesday morning. Somewhere downstairs, Dora was moving things with the decisive efficiency of a woman who ran her domain with absolute authority. The smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards the way it always did. Seraphine set her cup down. I am sorry, she said. Not for trying to protect you, I would do that again. But for the part of it that hurt you. For the 4 years, for the child who grew up without his father, and the woman who had to build everything alone because we ran out of time. She held Janelle's gaze. I am genuinely, completely sorry for that. Janelle looked at her, at this woman who had refused to be an instrument of someone else's cruelty, who had walked into a political arrangement with her eyes open and tried to do the least harmful version of something that had no clean options, who had carried the weight of the unintended consequence for 4 years and come to a healer's apartment above a bakery in a human city to say so in person when she could have sent a letter or said nothing at all. You were trying to save my life, Janelle said. Yes, and it went wrong. Yes. Janelle wrapped both hands around her cup. I know what it is, she said slowly, to do the best thing available to you in an impossible situation and have it cost more than you intended. She looked at Seraphine across the table. I am not able to be angry at you for that. Something shifted in Seraphine's expression, not quite relief, something quieter and more durable than relief. Conrad told me you built all of this yourself, she said, her eyes moving briefly around the warm, modest kitchen, the healer's shelves, the evidence of a life constructed from nothing with deliberate, careful hands. The practice, the home, the boy. She looked back at Janelle. He said it with the specific tone of a man who finally understands what he had. Janelle said nothing. You were stronger than any Luna the Council ever wanted, Seraphine said. It was not a compliment offered lightly or dressed in the soft language of consolation. It was a statement of assessment from a woman who had navigated the same institutional machinery from a different angle and understood exactly what it cost. They wanted someone manageable, someone whose power came entirely from proximity to the throne and could be revoked the same way. She shook her head slightly. You were never that. That was always why they feared you. The words landed somewhere Janelle had not expected. Not in the wounded place, the place that had spent 4 years quietly reassembling itself from the belief that she had been too small, too peripheral, too Omega for the life she had briefly been allowed to inhabit. They landed somewhere older and steadier than that. She thought about Master Fane's healing wing, the outer rings, the plain blue dress at the back of a grand hall, every room she had stood in where she was not supposed to be, doing the work anyway, with the hands she had always had. "I know that now," she said quietly. Seraphine nodded. They finished their tea without the need to fill the silence with anything further. When Seraphine stood to leave, she paused at the kitchen door. "My pack has a healers exchange program with 3 human cities in the Southern Territories," she said. "If you ever wanted a formal connection professional, nothing political, the offer exists." Janelle looked at her, at this woman who had never been her enemy, who had only ever been another piece on the same board, trying to move herself towards something real. "I'll think about it," she said. Seraphine almost smiled. Then she walked back down the narrow stairs and out through the bakery and into the Tuesday morning street. And when the door closed behind her, Janelle sat alone at the kitchen table for a long moment. The last piece of the old story had finally, quietly, released its hold. What remained was only the present, and the present, she had learned, was entirely enough. Time, Janelle had learned, was less like a river and more like a tide. It did not move in one clean direction. It came in and went out. It reshaped things gradually, without announcing what it was doing, so that you looked up one ordinary morning and realized the shoreline was entirely different from what it had been, and you could not identify the specific moment the change had happened. That was how the years after Conrad's visit passed. Not dramatically. Not with the clean narrative resolution of a story that knew where it was going, but in the small, accumulating way that real lives were built, one ordinary morning at a time, each one slightly different from the last, until the differences added up to something that deserved a name. The first visit to the Silverfang Kingdom happened when Elias was 5. Janelle had prepared him carefully, not with warnings or the layered anxiety of a mother trying to preempt every possible difficulty, but with information. Plain, honest, age-appropriate information about wolves and kingdoms, and the particular world his father came from. Elias had listened to all of it, with the focused attention he brought to everything, asked 11 questions in rapid succession, and then wanted to know if the castle had a kitchen bigger than Dora's. It did. He was delighted. She had stood at the border and watched Conrad take their son's hand and walk him through the gates of the Silverfang Kingdom for the first time, and she had felt the complex, layered thing that had no clean, single name, grief and relief and pride, and the particular tenderness of watching a child walk confidently into a world you had once fled, carrying none of your fear, because you had been careful never to hand it to him. She had turned and gone back to Varin. She had not cried until she was back in the apartment above the bakery. Then she had cried thoroughly, made herself tea, and gone to see 3 patients who needed her. Life, she had found, was cooperative that way. It kept providing reasons to keep moving. Conrad came to Varin on the first Tuesday of every month. This had not been formally scheduled, it had simply become true through repetition, the way most real arrangements became real. He came without entourage, in plain clothes, and he sat at the kitchen table and ate Dora's bread and talked with his son about wolves and moon cycles and the history of the Silverfang Kingdom, delivered in the specific installments that a child could absorb and request more of. He and Janelle had developed the particular fluency of 2 people who had negotiated a difficult peace and were committed to maintaining it. They talked about Elias, his questions, his progress, the Riverstone collection that had expanded to fill an entire shelf with the easy cooperation of people who had found, somewhere in the wreckage of what they used to be, a version of themselves that could sit at the same table without the weight of the old story pulling everything sideways. It was not without complexity. There were moments, quiet ones, usually when the apartment was warm and Elias was laughing at something his father had said, and the lamplight was doing something particular to the room, when the old grief moved through her like weather, not violently, just present, then passing, the way it had always been. She let it pass. That was the whole of the practice, she had decided. You felt it, and you let it pass, and you came back to the present, which was the only place any of it was actually happening. Elias asked her the question on a winter evening when he was 7. He was at the kitchen table with his lessons, and Conrad had left an hour earlier, and the apartment had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet. He asked it without looking up from his work, the casual delivery of a child raising something he had been carrying for a while, and had finally decided to put down. "Why didn't you go back to the palace?" Janelle set down the jar she was labeling. She thought about the corridor, the ring on the map, the healer's exit in the south wall, and the cold, pre-dawn air, and the deliberate choice not to look back. She thought about Varen, and the room above the bakery, and the years of building something that was entirely hers. She crossed to the table and sat beside him. "Because love should never ask you to forget who you are," she said softly. Elias considered this, with the serious expression he wore when he was filing something away for future use. "Did it?" he asked. "Ask you to forget?" "It tried to," she said. "I didn't let it." He nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when an answer had passed his internal standard of reasonableness. Then he went back to his lessons. The moon festival happened every year on the first full moon of autumn. When Elias was 10, he stood between both his parents at the edge of the festival grounds, while the kingdom lit its lanterns, and the moon came up enormous and silver over the Silverfang tree line. He was not a prince torn between two worlds. He had never been that because Janelle had been careful, from the very beginning, to make sure he understood that both worlds were entirely his, not competing claims on his loyalty, not a fault line he was required to stand on one side of. Simply the full, complicated, luminous inheritance of a child whose parents had loved each other imperfectly and chosen something better than bitterness when the imperfect love ran out. He was a bridge. He had always been a bridge. Conrad stood to Elias's right, tall and dark-haired, older now in the way the years of genuine responsibility aged a person. Something settled in his face that had not been there before, something that looked, from a certain angle, like peace. Janelle stood to Elias's left. At some point during the lighting of the lanterns, Conrad looked across their son's head and met her eyes. It was a brief look, quiet, carrying none of the old weight, none of the longing, or the grief, or the particular complicated ache of two people who had failed each other in the most complete way available to them. Only recognition. Two people who had once loved each other enough to create a life, who had chosen, when the love could no longer hold its original shape, to build something steadier in its place, who had kept choosing it, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, until it became simply the truth of who they were to each other. Janelle looked back at the lanterns rising slowly into the autumn dark. The moon once tied their hearts together, but in the end it was not love that kept them standing side by side beneath it. It was the boy between them, dark-haired and silver-eyed and entirely, completely himself, who had proven that even broken stories, told honestly and tended carefully, could still create something worth keeping, something beautiful, something that belonged, without apology, to all three of them. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more moonlit romance stories like this one.